You're standing at the edge of a fjord in Norway around the year 950 AD, and what you see is not a factory in the modern sense, but something just as impressive. A Viking shipyard where master craftsmen are building vessels capable of crossing the Atlantic Ocean, reaching North America centuries before Columbus, using nothing but axes, adzes, and an understanding of wood that borders on supernatural. The shipyard is open to the sky, positioned near the waterline, surrounded by stacks of oak logs, piles of iron rivets still warm from the forge, coils of tarred rope, and the constant sound of axes biting into timber. Smoke rises from the forge where blacksmiths are hammering out thousands of iron rivets, each one hand-shaped, each one critical to holding this ship together. You can smell the wood shavings, the pine tar, the salt air, and if you look closely at the half-finished hull rising from the supports, you'll see something remarkable. This entire ship, which will carry 30 warriors across open ocean, is being built without a single written plan. No blueprints, no measurements beyond the human eye, and the master builder's experience passed down through generations. The process begins months before anyone touches a tool in the shipyard, deep in the forest where the Vikings are selecting trees with a precision that seems almost ritualistic. They're looking for tall, straight oak trees, specifically oaks that have grown slowly in dense forest conditions, because slow growth means tight grain, and tight grain means strength and flexibility. Two qualities that will determine whether this ship survives a North Atlantic storm or breaks apart in the waves. But here's what makes Viking shipbuilding different from almost any other wooden construction. They're not going to saw these logs into planks, they're going to split them, following the natural grain of the wood, a technique called radial splitting that preserves the wood's structural integrity in ways that sawing never could. Each oak tree, carefully selected, carefully felled with axes in winter when the sap is down, will yield only a handful of planks, because the Vikings are splitting the log lengthwise from the center outward, creating planks that curve naturally with the tree's growth rings. This means massive waste. One tree might produce only 2 or 3 usable planks, but those planks will be stronger and more water-resistant than anything you could get from sawing. The logs are dragged from the forest to the shipyard using teams of oxen, a journey that can take days, and when they arrive, they're stacked and left to season, sometimes for years, because wet wood splits differently than seasoned wood, and the master builder knows exactly how dry each plank needs to be for its position in the ship. Now watch what happens when construction actually begins, because the Vikings are building this ship in a way that seems backwards to modern eyes. They start with the shell, the outer skin of the ship, and only after the hull is taking shape do they add the internal framework, the ribs and supports that most shipbuilders would install first. The first piece to go down is the keel, a single massive oak timber that runs the entire length of the ship, perfectly straight, shaped with axes and adzes until it's smooth as glass on the bottom and precisely curved on the sides. This keel is everything. It's the backbone of the vessel, and the Vikings are choosing their finest oak for this piece because if the keel fails, the entire ship fails. They're placing it on wooden supports that hold it at exactly the right height and angle, and already the master builder is eyeing its curves, checking its straightness by sighting down its length, making tiny adjustments that seem imperceptible but will affect how this ship handles in the water. Then comes the stem and stern posts, massive curved timbers that sweep up from each end of the keel, shaped from naturally curved oak called compass timber, where the Vikings have selected trees that grew with the exact curve they need, following the tree's natural growth, rather than trying to bend the wood artificially. These posts are attached to the keel with complex scarf joints, overlapping joints that are carved with such precision that they lock together without glue, held by wooden pegs and the weight of everything that will be built above them. Now comes the technique that defines Viking shipbuilding, the method that allowed these vessels to be both incredibly strong and remarkably light, flexible enough to twist with the waves, yet rigid enough to hold their shape in the worst storms. Clinker construction, also called lapstrake, where each plank overlaps the one below it like shingles on a roof. The first strake, the bottom plank, is shaped to fit the curve where the keel meets the stem post. And this is where you see the Viking shipbuilder's true skill, because this plank is being shaped by eye, carved with an adze, bent with controlled heat and moisture, fitted and refitted until it follows the exact curve the builder envisions. Once it's perfect, they drill holes along its upper edge, carefully spaced. And here's where those hand-forged iron rivets come in. Each rivet is pushed through from the outside, and on the inside, a worker is placing a small square washer called a rove. Then the end of the rivet is hammered over the rove, creating a permanent join that's both watertight and flexible. The next plank overlaps the first, creating a slight step, and it's riveted in the same way, and the next, each one following a curve that exists only in the master builder's mind, each one shaped individually because no two planks are identical, and slowly, plank by plank, the shell of the ship is taking form, rising from the keel like a living thing, curving inward slightly as it rises, then flaring out at the top to create the distinctive lines that make Viking ships instantly recognizable. What you're watching is a hull being built that will flex with the waves rather than fight them, and that flexibility is intentional, designed into every joint, every rivet, every overlap, because in the North Atlantic, a rigid ship is a dead ship, and the Vikings figured this out through trial, error, and probably centuries of lost vessels. The workers are using tools that would look primitive in any modern workshop, but are perfectly suited to their task. Axes for rough shaping, adzes for smoothing curves, augers for drilling rivet holes, draw knives for fine work. And here's something that surprises most people. These tools are sharp enough to shave with, maintained with obsessive care, because dull tools mean torn wood fibers, and torn fibers mean weak points, and weak points mean leaks. The shipbuilders are also using something called a master frame, a template that helps maintain the ship's symmetry, but it's not a precise technical drawing. It's more like a guide, and the master builder is constantly checking the hull's shape by eye, by feel, by running his hands over the curves, and making adjustments that seem instinctive but are based on decades of experience. As the hull rises higher, they're adding more strakes, usually 9 to 12 on each side for a typical longship, and each strake is slightly narrower than the one below it, creating that characteristic curve from the broad bottom to the narrower top rail. The overlap between planks is about 2 fingers wide, consistent all along the hull, and they're caulking these overlaps with animal hair, usually wool soaked in pine tar, pressed into the gap before the planks are riveted together. This pine tar is being produced in the forest, made by burning pine wood in a covered pit, and collecting the thick black resin that runs out. And it's one of the Vikings' secret weapons. It's waterproof, it preserves the wood, it remains flexible in cold water, and it smells so strong that you can detect a tarred Viking ship from miles away. Now something interesting happens that shows how different this construction method is from modern shipbuilding. Only after the hull is completely planked up, only after the entire shell is formed, do they start adding the internal structure, the ribs and crossbeams that will give the ship its rigidity and support the deck and cargo. These ribs aren't load-bearing in the way you might expect. The shell is already strong enough to hold its shape. The ribs are there to maintain that shape, to prevent the planks from spreading, to provide attachment points for the deck beams and the mast support. They're cutting these ribs from naturally curved oak, again using the tree's growth pattern rather than trying to bend straight timber, and they're shaping each rib to fit precisely against the inside curve of the hull, a curve that varies along the ship's length. The ribs are attached to the planks using wooden pegs called tree nails, driven through pre-drilled holes, and also with leather straps that allow some flexibility, because, remember, this ship needs to twist and flex with the waves. The spacing between ribs varies depending on where you are in the ship. Closer together near the mast, where the loads are highest, farther apart toward the ends where flexibility is more important. Cross beams are being installed next, running from side to side, notched into the upper strakes, and these beams will support the deck planking and also serve as rowing benches because this ship will be powered by both sail and oars, giving it the versatility to navigate in any conditions. The mast is going in now, and this is one of the most critical moments in the construction because the mast will put enormous loads on the hull, especially when the ship is sailing close to the wind or in heavy weather. The Vikings are installing something called a mast fish, a massive block of wood that sits on the keel and is shaped to hold the base of the mast, and above it a mast partner, a heavy timber that spans between the sides of the ship and has a square hole through which the mast passes. The mast itself is a single pine log, tall and straight, shaped smooth and tapering toward the top, and it's designed to be raised and lowered, not permanently fixed, which means the crew can drop the mast quickly when approaching shore or when rowing into battle. The rigging is being prepared in parallel, walrus hide ropes for the stays that will support the mast fore and aft, twisted linen or wool lines for the halyards that raise and lower the sail, leather straps for attaching everything. The sail itself is being woven by women in the village, a massive square of wool cloth that will be treated with red ochre or other pigments, both for appearance and to make it more water resistant. And it will take months to weave a single sail, with every woman in the community contributing to what is essentially a collective work of art and engineering. The ship is nearly complete now, but there's still critical work to be done, and this is where the quality control happens, Viking style, without laboratories or testing equipment, but with methods that have been proven over centuries of ocean crossings. First, they're checking every rivet, every joint, every seam, looking for any weakness. And here's something you need to understand about Viking standards. If a rivet is loose, if a plank doesn't fit perfectly, if there's any doubt about a joint's strength, they tear it out and do it again. No compromises, because everyone knows that lives depend on this ship's integrity. They're recalking any seams that look questionable, pressing more wool and tar into the overlaps, and they're treating the entire hull with more pine tar, inside and out, coating it so heavily that it drips, because this tar is the ship's first defense against rot, against shipworm, against the constant assault of salt water. The deck planks are going in, loose laid without permanent attachment, so they can be removed for bailing or for access to cargo stored below. And they're fitting out the ship with all the equipment it needs, oar ports with shutters to keep water out when not rowing, a side rudder mounted on the starboard side near the stern, bilge pumps made from hollowed logs, sleeping bags made from leather or walrus hide, storage chests that double as rowing benches, weapons racks, anchor stones. Since they don't have iron anchors heavy enough for a ship this size, now comes the first real test, and it's the one that will prove whether all this work, all these months of labor, all this accumulated knowledge has produced a seaworthy vessel or an expensive piece of firewood. They're launching the ship, sliding it down wooden rollers into the fjord, and for the first time, this shell of oak and iron and tar is floating, and everyone is watching the waterline, looking for signs of leaking, checking how she sits in the water, whether she floats level or lists to one side. The master builder is examining every detail, watching how the hull flexes as waves pass under her, listening for any creaks or groans that might indicate a weak point, and if everything looks good, they'll load her with ballast stones, heavy rocks placed low in the hull to lower the center of gravity, making her more stable under sail. Then comes the sailing trial, and this is where the crew finds out if this ship can do what Vikings need her to do: sail into the wind, run before a storm, handle in heavy seas, respond to the rudder, and most importantly, keep her crew alive when they're days from land with no shelter and no way back. They're taking her out into the open ocean, raising the sail for the first time, feeling how she handles when the wind fills that massive square of wool. And good Viking ship will sail at angles that seem impossible, for a square-rigged vessel, thanks to her deep keel and her flexible hull that actually twists with the pressure of the wind and the waves. The crew is learning her personality. Every ship is different, how she likes to be steered, how she behaves in a following sea, whether she tends to round up into the wind or fall off, and they're making minor adjustments, tweaking the rigging, repositioning the ballast, until she handles exactly as they need. Back at the shipyard, they're doing the final finishing, and this is where a working vessel becomes something more, something that represents not just transportation, but identity and pride. They're carving the dragon head for the prow, a snarling serpent or dragon that will terrify enemies and, according to tradition, ward off evil spirits. And they're painting the shields that will hang along the sides, brightly colored discs that serve both as decoration and as additional protection against arrows and spears. The oar ports are being fitted with wooden shutters that can be closed when not rowing, preventing water from washing in through these openings. And the crew is being trained in the coordinated rowing technique that allows 30 men to pull in perfect rhythm, moving the ship at surprising speed, even without wind. Here's something that makes Viking ships unique in maritime history. They're built to be beached, to be run right up onto shore. Because the Vikings aren't looking for deep water harbors, they're raiding, trading, and exploring places where no harbors exist. And they need to be able to beach their ships, unload quickly, and if necessary, launch again just as fast. The flat bottom and shallow draft that allow this also mean the ship can navigate rivers and shallow coastal waters that would be impossible for deeper-keeled vessels, giving the Vikings access to places their enemies never expected to see ships. The finished vessel sitting at the dock represents something remarkable. Using only tools that would seem primitive to modern eyes, using only materials that grow in the forest or can be forged from bog iron. Working without plans or measurements beyond the human eye and generations of accumulated knowledge, the Vikings have created a ship that will cross the Atlantic Ocean, that will reach North America, Greenland, Iceland, the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, carrying warriors and traders and explorers thousands of miles from home and bringing them back alive. She's about 70 feet long, draws only 3 feet of water when fully loaded, can carry 30 to 40 people plus cargo, can sail at speeds up to 15 knots under ideal conditions, can be rowed when there's no wind, can be beached anywhere, can flex with the waves without breaking, and will last for decades with proper maintenance. And all of this was achieved not with modern engineering, but with empirical knowledge, with trial and error, with careful observation of what works and what doesn't, with techniques passed down from master to apprentice over centuries, and with a deep understanding of wood, water, and wind that few modern builders can match. The ship that seemed impossible at the start, that began as a pile of logs in a muddy shipyard, that took shape plank by plank and rivet by rivet, is now ready to carry Vikings across oceans that most of the world believed were uncrossable, proving that sometimes the most advanced technology isn't the newest, but the most perfectly adapted to its purpose, refined over generations until every detail serves the goal of keeping humans alive in one of the most hostile environments on Earth, the open ocean far from land, with nothing between you and the abyss but oak planks held together with iron and tar, and the knowledge of people who understood that flexibility is stronger than rigidity, that following the wood's nature produces better results than forcing it into unnatural shapes, and that a ship built with patience and skill and respect for materials will outlast and outperform vessels built with more advanced tools, but less understanding of the fundamental relationship between wood and water and the human need to cross impossible distances in search of whatever lies beyond the horizon.